A young girl named Maya sat shivering under a flickering street lamp in the park, clutching an old scarf as if it were her only shield from the world. When Officer James noticed her during his routine patrol, his years of emotional detachment were tested in ways he never imagined. As her heartbreaking story unfolded, his guarded exterior began to crumble. How would this single night change their lives forever? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories of resilience and hope, don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring content. Officer James Harris drove his patrol car down the empty streets, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the practiced attentiveness of a seasoned cop. The air was still, interrupted only by the distant hum of a lawnmower and the chirping of birds settling in for the night. It seemed like any other uneventful evening, and James, weary from a long day, was ready for his shift to wind down. As he passed the local playground, something caught his attention. In the fading light, he spotted a small figure huddled on a bench near the swings. Slowing his car, James squinted through the windshield. It was a little girl, no older than 7 or 8, curled up with her knees to her chest. Her dark hair framed a face that looked far too somber for someone her age. James pulled over, his boots crunching against the gravel as he stepped out. The setting sun painted a gentle glow on the scene, but the sight of the child alone in the open tore through his usual stoic demeanor. He approached cautiously, not wanting to frighten her. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said, his voice softer than usual. "What are you doing out here all by yourself?" The girl looked up, startled by his presence. Her large brown eyes reflected fear and exhaustion. She clutched a small, worn backpack tightly to her chest, as though it contained everything she had in the world. "I'm waiting for my mom," she whispered, barely audible. Her voice trembled, and James could see her lip quiver. James crouched to her level, keeping his tone gentle. "Waiting for your mom, huh? Do you know where she is?" The girl hesitated, looking down at the backpack she held. "She said she had to go find work. She promised she'd come back, but it's been a while." Her voice cracked on the last words. James's heart clenched. He took a deep breath, trying to process the weight of what she was saying. "How long have you been here, honey?" he asked gently. The girl looked away, her small fingers fiddling with the zipper of her bag. "A few days, I think. I've been sleeping under the slide when it gets dark." James felt a wave of disbelief and sadness wash over him. A little girl, all alone, sleeping in a playground. It was unthinkable. He wanted to reach out and comfort her, but years of being a cop had taught him to tread carefully in fragile moments like this. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. "Maya," she whispered, barely meeting his eyes. "Okay, Maya," James said, his voice soft but firm. "It's not safe for you to stay out here. Let me take you somewhere warm for tonight and we'll figure everything else out together. Does that sound okay?" Maya hesitated, her eyes darting between James and the playground. She seemed reluctant to leave. "But what if my mom comes back? She won't know where I am." James placed a reassuring hand over his heart. "I promise you, Maya, I'll do everything I can to help find your mom. But right now, I need to make sure you're safe." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes, and for a moment, James thought she might bolt. But then slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling. He extended his hand, and Maya reluctantly placed her tiny fingers in his. Leading her to the patrol car, James opened the passenger door and helped her in, draping a spare jacket over her shoulders to ward off the evening chill. As he drove to the station, James kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She sat quietly, her hands gripping the backpack tightly, her eyes staring out at the darkening streets. James's thoughts swirled. He had dealt with countless difficult situations in his career, but something about this little girl struck a nerve. She wasn't just another case. Her vulnerability, her quiet courage, it all made him want to protect her in a way he hadn't felt in years. By the time they reached the station, the sky was an inky black. James parked and guided Maya inside, keeping her close as they passed bustling officers and ringing phones. He brought her to his desk, pulled out a blanket from the emergency supplies, and wrapped it around her. "Wait here, okay?" he said gently. "I'm going to make some calls and see what we can do to help you." Maya nodded, her expression weary but trusting. James watched her settle into the chair, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. As he turned to pick up the phone, he made a silent promise. He wouldn't stop until he found her mother and brought them back together. The station was quieter than usual, the low hum of computers and occasional murmurs of officers the only sounds filling the air. James sat at his desk, staring at the notes he had jotted down about Maya. The girl was asleep on a small cot in one of the private rooms, her tiny frame bundled up in the blanket he had given her. It had taken her a long time to drift off, her little hands clutching her backpack even in sleep. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting on that bench in the playground, waiting for a mother who might not return. There was a lump in his throat as he thought about the fear she must have felt, the hunger, the loneliness. He picked up the phone and began making calls. The first was to social services. They promised to arrange a temporary foster placement, but James couldn't shake the feeling that Maya needed something more than bureaucracy could provide. He thanked the agent and hung up, his brow furrowed. His next call was to dig into Emily, the mother Maya had described with such devotion. Using the station's database, James searched for records, employment history, past addresses, and any recent activity. As he worked, bits and pieces of Emily's life began to emerge, a patchwork of struggles and resilience. Emily Adams, 28, had been juggling part-time jobs to support her daughter. A waitress here, a cashier there, always temporary, always barely enough. Her last known address was a rundown apartment complex across town, but she had been evicted months ago. James's chest tightened as he scrolled through the eviction notice, imagining Emily packing up her life with nowhere to go. Another document revealed a restraining order against a former partner. James frowned. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Emily had been fighting battles on every front, financial, emotional, and personal. Yet despite everything, she had tried to shield Maya from the worst of it. A quiet knock on his desk broke his concentration. James looked up to see Officer Ramirez, his longtime colleague, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You've been at it for hours," Ramirez said, setting 1 cup in front of James. "What's the story?" James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Little girl, Maya Carter. Her mom left to find work and never came back. Kid's been on her own for days." Ramirez whistled softly, shaking his head. "That's rough. Any leads?" "Some," James admitted, gesturing to the files. "But nothing concrete. No recent activity, no friends or family to reach out to. It's like she just disappeared." Ramirez took a sip of his coffee, studying James. "You're taking this one pretty hard, huh?" James didn't answer immediately. He stared at the steaming cup in his hands, his thoughts drifting to Maya. "She's just a kid," he said finally, his voice quiet. "No one should have to go through that." Ramirez nodded, clapping James on the shoulder. "Let me know if you need anything." When Ramirez walked away, James returned to his search, the weight of the case pressing on him. He stayed late into the night, his desk lamp casting a lonely glow over the scattered papers. By the time James got home, the clock was edging towards midnight. His small apartment felt emptier than usual. The neatly arranged furniture and spotless countertops only emphasized the silence. He set his keys on the table and sat down heavily on the couch, running a hand through his hair. James had always been a solitary man. The long hours of his job left little room for a personal life, and he had convinced himself that was fine. But tonight, as he thought about Maya sleeping in the station's cot, something inside him shifted. The quiet of his apartment didn't feel like peace. It felt like loneliness. He glanced at the photo on the mantel, a younger version of himself with his late father, who had also been an officer. His father had always said that their job was about more than just enforcing the law. It was about protecting the vulnerable. James felt those words more acutely now than ever. His thoughts drifted to Emily. What kind of desperation must she have felt to leave her daughter in a playground while she searched for work? What fears and sacrifices had she endured to keep Maya safe? And where was she now? James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He had dealt with tough cases before. But this felt different. This wasn't just about solving a problem or closing a file. It was about a little girl with a spark in her eyes and a heartbreaking story that refused to leave his mind. The morning light filtered through the blinds of the foster care center's playroom, painting soft golden stripes on the worn linoleum floor. Maya sat cross-legged on a colorful rug, carefully arranging plastic teacups for an imaginary tea party. Her stuffed bear, Mr. Buttons, sat propped up as her guest of honor. James stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before clearing his throat gently. Maya looked up, her face lighting up with a smile as she recognized him.
"Officer James!"
she exclaimed, jumping to her feet and running toward him. James knelt down, producing a small box wrapped in cheerful paper. "Morning, Maya. Thought you could use a little something today." Her eyes widened as she carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a tiny tea set with delicate painted flowers. "It's beautiful," she whispered, cradling the pieces in her hands. "Now Mr. Buttons and I can have a real tea party." James chuckled, the corners of his usually serious face softening. "I thought he might appreciate the upgrade." Maya giggled and grabbed his hand, pulling him toward her setup on the rug. "Come on, you can join us. Mr. Buttons doesn't mind sharing." James hesitated, glancing around the room, but Maya's pleading eyes left him no choice. With a resigned smile, he sat cross-legged beside her, awkwardly holding a miniature teacup between his fingers. As the tea party continued, Maya began to chatter, her words flowing easily now that she had grown more comfortable around James. "Mommy used to make real tea for me," Maya said, placing an imaginary cookie on a tiny plate. "She'd let me stir it with a spoon, but only after it cooled down. She said I was her little helper." James listened intently, his heart tightening at the warmth in Maya's voice. "She sounds like a great mom," he said softly. "She is," Maya replied, her tone wistful. "She always worked so hard. Sometimes she'd come home late and look so tired, but she'd still read me a bedtime story. She said no matter how busy she was, I'd always be her priority." James swallowed hard, his throat tight. "She sounds pretty special." Maya nodded solemnly. "She said everything she does is for me. That's why I know she'll come back. She promised." The unwavering trust in Maya's voice was both inspiring and heartbreaking. James reached out, gently patting her shoulder. "You're right, Maya. She loves you more than anything. And I promise, I'm going to do everything I can to help you see her again." Maya looked up at him, her big eyes shining with gratitude. "Thanks, Officer James. You're nice. Mommy would like you." James felt an unexpected warmth at her words, and a small smile tugged at his lips. "I'd like her too." Over the next several days, James visited Maya whenever he could, often bringing small gifts or treats, a coloring book, a pack of crayons, a chocolate bar. Each time, Maya greeted him with the same bright smile, and they'd sit together while she shared stories about her mother. Through Maya's innocent recollections, James learned more about Emily, her love for singing while she cooked, her knack for fixing things around the house, her endless determination to give Maya a better life. Each detail painted a vivid picture of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her daughter. One evening, after dropping Maya off at the foster care center, James sat in his patrol car, staring at the fading light of dusk. He couldn't shake the weight of her stories or the way Maya's eyes lit up whenever she talked about her mother. Determined to follow every lead, James picked up his phone and called the diner Emily had worked at months earlier. The manager was polite but had little to offer. "She was a hard worker," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "But she left suddenly. Said she had to take care of something personal." The call ended with no new information, but James refused to give up. He started tracing Emily's movements, piecing together her life from eviction notices, employment records, and sightings at local shelters. Finally, a breakthrough came. A worker at a nearby community center mentioned seeing a woman matching Emily's description volunteering at their food bank. James's heart raced as he jotted down the address. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was the first solid lead he'd found in days. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket, his resolve hardening. The next day, James visited Maya again. As they sat on the rug with her tea set, he leaned forward, his voice gentle but serious. "Maya, I think I might have found a place where your mom went," he said. Her eyes widened with hope, and she gripped his hand tightly. "Really? Can we go find her?" James nodded. "I'm going to check it out soon, but I need you to be patient, okay? I promise I'll let you know as soon as I learn more." Maya smiled, her faith in him unshaken. "I trust you, Officer James. You're like a hero." James chuckled softly, though her words hit him deeply. "I'm just trying to do what's right, Maya." As he left the center that evening, James couldn't help but feel a growing sense of connection to the little girl who had trusted him so completely. For the first time in a long time, he felt that his work was about more than just duty. It was about making a real difference in someone's life. And as he drove off toward the lead on Emily, he silently vowed not to let Maya down. The cold fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway reflected off the polished tiles as James approached the reception desk. His heart pounded with a mix of hope and anxiety. Clutching the small slip of paper with the address of the community center where Emily had last been seen, he had followed a tenuous trail that led him here, to a local hospital. "Excuse me," he said to the nurse at the desk, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside. "I'm Officer James Carter, investigating a missing persons case. I'm looking for a woman named Emily Adams. She might have been admitted here recently." The nurse typed on her keyboard, her face neutral. After a moment, her expression softened. "Yes, we have a patient by that name. She was brought in after a car accident about 3 weeks ago. She's in room 312, but..." She hesitated, her voice lowering. "She's in a coma." James felt the air leave his lungs. A coma. The word echoed in his mind, heavy and final. He managed a nod and muttered, "Thank you," before turning toward the elevator. The ride to the 3rd floor felt like an eternity. James stared at the numbers above the elevator doors, his hands clenching and unclenching. A part of him wanted to stop the car and leave, to not confront whatever waited for him in room 312. But Maya's hopeful face flashed in his mind, her unwavering faith that her mother would return. He owed it to her to keep going. When the elevator doors opened, James stepped out, his boots clicking softly against the tile floor. He moved down the hallway, his heart pounding harder with every step. At last, he reached the door to room 312. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open. Inside, the room was quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. A woman lay on the hospital bed, her face pale against the stark white sheets. Bandages wrapped her head, and an IV line trailed from her arm to a nearby machine. James took a step closer, his breath catching as he studied her face. Even through the bruises and swelling, he recognized her. "Emily," he whispered, his voice breaking. Memories surged to the surface, laughing under the bleachers during high school football games, stolen kisses in the back of his old truck, whispered promises of forever. It was her, Emily, his high school sweetheart, the girl who had once been his whole world. James sank into the chair beside the bed, his hands trembling. The weight of the revelation pressed down on him, leaving him breathless. How had life brought them to this moment? He stared at her, trying to reconcile the vibrant, determined young woman he had known with the fragile figure lying before him. After a few minutes, James stood and approached the bedside table, where a small file sat. He opened it hesitantly, scanning the details of her accident. A car had veered off the road late at night, and Emily had been rushed to the hospital with severe injuries. There had been no contact information, no family listed, just an anonymous woman fighting for her life. The guilt hit him like a wave. Had he stayed in touch after high school? Could he have been there for her? Could he have prevented this? He clenched his jaw, anger and regret swirling within him. James reached out and took her hand gently in his voice trembling. "Emily, it's me. James. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm here. And I found Maya. She's safe. She's waiting for you." He paused, the lump in his throat making it hard to speak. "I don't know how we ended up here, but I promise I'll take care of her until you're ready. I'll bring her to see you as soon as I can. Just come back to us." The nurse from earlier entered the room quietly, breaking James's reverie. "Officer Carter," she said softly. "Do you know her?" James nodded, still gripping Emily's hand. "Yes. We used to be close. And her daughter Maya. She's been waiting for her mom to come back." The nurse's face softened. "I've seen cases like this before. Sometimes hearing familiar voices can help. Keep talking to her. Let her know she's not alone." James nodded again, determination flickering in his eyes. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said firmly, "and I'll bring Maya with me." As he left the hospital, his emotions were a tangle of guilt, grief, and resolve. He couldn't change the past, but he could ensure that Emily and Maya's future was brighter. And though the road ahead was uncertain, James vowed to walk it with them, every step of the way. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the foster care center as James sat across from Maya in a quiet room. She clutched a well-loved stuffed bunny, her small fingers fidgeting with its floppy ears. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension, were fixed on him. "Did you find her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is she okay?" James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He had rehearsed this conversation 100 times on the drive over, but the words still felt heavy on his tongue. He couldn't sugarcoat the truth, but he also didn't want to extinguish the flicker of hope in Maya's heart. "I did find your mom," he began softly, his voice steady but gentle. Maya's face lit up for a brief moment, her grip on the bunny tightening. "She's safe, but she's in the hospital right now. She was in an accident." Maya's brows furrowed, her lips parting in silent confusion. "An accident?" she echoed. James nodded, taking a deep breath. "She's asleep, Maya. The doctors call it a coma. That means she can't wake up just yet, but she's getting all the care she needs. They're doing everything they can to help her heal." Maya's eyes welled with tears, and she looked down at her bunny, her small shoulders trembling. "Will she wake up?" she asked, her voice cracking with fear. James slid closer to her, his heart breaking at the sight of her vulnerability. "We don't know exactly when, but I believe she will," he said earnestly. "Your mom is strong, and she loves you so much. She's fighting to come back to you." Maya sniffled, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her sweater. "I miss her," she whispered. "I miss her so much." James placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know you do, Maya, and she misses you too. But until she wakes up, I promise I'll be here for you. You're not alone in this." In the days that followed, James kept his promise. He visited Maya daily, bringing small gifts, a coloring book, her favorite snacks, or a storybook to read together. Each visit strengthened the bond between them, and Maya began to smile more often, her resilience shining through the pain. One afternoon, as James walked into the care center, Maya ran up to him, a drawing clutched in her hands. "Look, Uncle James," she exclaimed, holding it up proudly. It was a crayon drawing of a hospital bed with a smiling woman, a small girl, and a man in a uniform standing beside her. James's heart swelled at the sight. "Uncle James, huh?" he said with a soft chuckle, crouching down to her level. Maya shrugged shyly but smiled. "You take care of me like family," she said simply. James felt a lump rise in his throat, and he gave her a warm smile. "I'm honored, Maya," he said, ruffling her hair gently. "And I'll always be here for you, just like family." Each evening, James made his way to Emily's hospital room after his shift. Sitting by her bedside, he shared stories about Maya's day, the drawings she'd made, the way her laughter lit up the care center, and how brave she was being. "You'd be so proud of her, Emily," he said one night, his voice soft. He looked at her peaceful face, hoping she could hear him. "She talks about you all the time, about how you sing to her, how you always make her smile. She misses you, but she's holding on." James often found himself lingering longer than he intended. his words spilling out in a steady stream. It wasn't just for Emily's sake, it was for his own. Talking to her, even in her unconscious state, brought him a strange sense of solace. One day, as James sat beside Emily, he held Maya's latest drawing in his hands. "Maya drew this for you," he said, showing it to her. "She says it's how she imagines things will be when you wake up. She's already planning all the things she wants to tell you." He chuckled softly, his eyes misting over. "She's something special, Emily, just like her mom." James's visits became a routine, a steady rhythm that brought him closer to both Maya and Emily. And as the days turned into weeks, the connection he felt with them deepened. He wasn't just a police officer fulfilling a duty. He was becoming a part of their lives in a way he hadn't anticipated. For Maya, he was a source of strength and stability. For Emily, he was a voice in the quiet, a reminder that she wasn't alone. And for himself, he was discovering a renewed sense of purpose, a reason to believe in hope, love, and second chances. And every night as James drove home, he found his own once-empty apartment beginning to feel less lonely. It wasn't just a place he went to after work anymore. It was a space where he carried the warmth of the bond he was building with Maya and Emily. A bond that was changing all their lives. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds, casting a soft glow on Emily's face. Her eyelids fluttered, and she let out a faint groan, her fingers twitching against the bedsheets. A nurse noticed the movement and immediately called for the doctor. It wasn't long before Emily's eyes opened fully, her gaze unfocused but alive. "You're awake," the nurse said gently, her voice tinged with relief. "Welcome back, Emily." Emily's throat felt dry and her body was weak, but she managed to whisper, "Maya. Where's Maya?" The nurse smiled, squeezing her hand. "She's safe, Emily. I'll let Officer James know you're awake. He'll want to bring her to see you." At the foster care center, James was just finishing his daily visit with Maya when his phone buzzed. Seeing the hospital's number on the screen, he quickly answered. As the nurse shared the news, James felt a wave of emotion crash over him. Relief, joy, and anticipation all at once. "Maya," he said, crouching down to her level. "I have some big news for you." Maya tilted her head, her wide eyes full of curiosity. "What is it, Uncle James?" James smiled, his voice gentle but excited. "Your mom is awake, sweetheart. She's awake and asking for you." Maya gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes as her lips quivered with a mix of joy and disbelief. "Really?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can I see her?" James nodded, holding out his hand. "Let's go see her together." The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity for Maya. She sat quietly in the back seat, clutching a small bouquet of daisies she had picked earlier that morning. James glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his heart aching at the mix of hope and fear on her face. When they arrived, James held Maya's hand tightly as they walked through the hospital corridors. With each step closer to Emily's room, Maya's grip grew firmer, her small fingers trembling in his. When they finally reached the door, James knelt down beside her. "She's right inside," he said softly. "Take your time, and remember, she's been waiting for you just as much as you've been waiting for her." Maya nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks. Clutching her flowers tightly, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. Emily turned her head at the sound of the door, her eyes filling with tears as she saw her daughter. "Maya," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "Mommy!" Maya cried, dropping the bouquet as she ran to her mother's bedside. She threw her arms around Emily, holding her as tightly as her small frame would allow. Emily winced slightly but wrapped her arms around Maya, her fingers gently stroking her daughter's hair. "I missed you so much, Mommy," Maya sobbed, her words muffled against Emily's hospital gown. "I missed you too, my sweet girl," Emily replied, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry I left you. I never wanted to." Maya shook her head, looking up at her mother. "It's okay. Uncle James took care of me. He helped me find you." At that moment, Emily's gaze shifted to James, who stood quietly by the door, his arms crossed, but his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Emily's lips trembled as she spoke. "James, I don't know how to thank you." James stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You don't have to, Emily. I just did what anyone would do. Maya is an incredible kid, and she made it easy to care about her." Emily held James's gaze, her gratitude evident in her tear-filled eyes. "You didn't just protect her, you gave her hope, and you gave me hope too." As the reunion unfolded, James watched from a respectful distance, feeling like an outsider, but also deeply moved by the scene before him. This was what he had fought for, a mother and daughter, finally together again. Yet, as he looked at Maya and Emily, he realized he wasn't just an observer. He had become part of their story, part of their family. When Maya turned and beckoned him closer, James hesitated for a moment before stepping to Emily's bedside. Maya reached out, taking his hand in one of hers and her mother's in the other. "See, Mommy," she said, her voice filled with innocent certainty. "I told you Uncle James is family." James felt his chest tighten as he looked at Emily, who gave him a small, knowing smile. "She's right, you know," Emily said softly. "You are family now." That evening, as James drove Maya back to her temporary foster home, she was unusually quiet, her head resting against the window. Finally, she spoke. "Uncle James." "Yes, sweetheart." "Do you think Mommy will get better soon?" James glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression gentle. "I do. She's strong, just like you, and we'll both be there to help her every step of the way." Maya smiled faintly, her trust in him shining through her tired eyes. "I'm glad you're here, Uncle James. I don't know what we'd do without you." James's heart swelled at her words, and he realized just how much Maya and Emily had changed his life. This wasn't just about fulfilling his duty, it was about love, connection, and finding a purpose he hadn't known he was searching for. The weeks following Emily's recovery and reunion with Maya were filled with hope, but also challenges. James had spent hours balancing his work and helping Emily transition from the hospital to daily life. Emily's body was healing, but the weight of her past struggles lingered. She was determined to rebuild her life, but James couldn't let her face it alone. One crisp morning, as James sipped his coffee in the precinct's break room, his mind was elsewhere. He'd been contemplating how to provide Emily and Maya with more than just temporary stability. They needed a place to truly call home, a safe space where they could begin their new life. "Something on your mind, James?" asked Officer Kelly, his partner, interrupting his thoughts. James nodded slowly, setting his mug down. "Yeah, I'm thinking about a little girl and her mom who deserve a fresh start." James's first call was to the landlord of a small, cozy apartment complex on the quieter side of town. It was close to Maya's school and a community park. The rent was reasonable, but the space needed work. James saw it as an opportunity to bring the community together, just as Emily and Maya had brought life back into his world. He enlisted the help of his precinct, neighbors, and local businesses. The response was overwhelming. Some donated furniture, others pitched in with paint and tools, and a few even offered to cover the first few months of rent. The apartment began to transform into a home, one room at a time. On a Saturday morning, James arrived at the nearly finished apartment with Maya, who clutched his hand tightly as they stepped inside. Her wide eyes darted around the freshly painted walls and sunlight-filled rooms. "This is for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James knelt down beside her, his warm smile reassuring. "It's for you and your mom. A place where you can feel safe and happy." Maya threw her arms around his neck, her gratitude evident in her tight embrace. "Thank you, Uncle James," she said, her voice filled with joy. Her words tugged at his heart. Over time, Maya's trust had grown into something deeper, something familial. James had become more than just the officer who found her that fateful night. He was her protector, her guide, and now, her family. That afternoon, James brought Emily to see the apartment for the first time. As they stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat. The small living room was adorned with thoughtful touches, a hand-sewn quilt draped over the couch, cheerful flowers on the windowsill, and a framed photo of her and Maya on the side table. I don't know what to say," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. She turned to James, tears welling up in her eyes. "You've already done so much for us. This is more than I could have ever dreamed." James shrugged, trying to play it off, though his own emotions were threatening to bubble over. "You and Maya have been through so much. You deserve this, and more." Emily smiled through her tears, reaching out to take his hand. "Thank you, James. Not just for this, but for everything, for being there when we needed you most." The next weekend, James organized a housewarming gathering. It wasn't grand, but it was heartfelt. The neighbors who had helped with the apartment came to celebrate. The precinct officers arrived with balloons and baked goods. Laughter filled the air as children played outside, and adults shared stories of how they'd come together to create something special for Emily and Maya. During the gathering, Maya stood on a chair in the middle of the living room, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "I want to say something," she announced, her voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The chatter quieted as all eyes turned to her. James and Emily exchanged a curious glance, then looked at Maya. "Uncle James," Maya began, her eyes locking onto his. "You're my hero. You didn't just find me. You made me feel safe. And you made my mom smile again. You're the best person I've ever known." James felt his throat tighten, emotion threatening to spill over. He managed a shaky smile, his voice hoarse as he responded. "Thank you, Maya. But the truth is, you and your mom have done just as much for me. You've reminded me what it means to be part of a family." Emily, standing beside James, placed a hand on his arm, her own tears glistening in the warm light. "He's right," she said, her voice soft but strong. "We're all building this future together step by step, and James, you've been the one holding us steady." As the evening wound down, James found himself standing on the balcony with Emily, watching the last of the guests leave. Maya had fallen asleep on the couch, her face peaceful, clutching the stuffed animal James had given her months ago. Emily turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know what we would have done without you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've given us hope when we had none." James met her gaze, his eyes steady. "And you've given me purpose when I felt like I didn't have one. You and Maya. You've changed my life." Emily smiled, her hand brushing lightly against his. "I think we've all found something we didn't know we were missing." They stood there for a while, the cool evening breeze carrying with it a sense of promise. At that moment, James knew this wasn't just about rebuilding Emily and Maya's life. It was about building a future they would all share, together. Months had passed since the community came together to give Emily and Maya their new home. The cozy apartment, once a humble dream, was now a sanctuary filled with laughter, warmth, and love. For James, it had become a second home, a place where he wasn't just an officer or a friend, but family. James sat on the couch, a picture book spread across his lap as Maya nestled beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. She pointed eagerly at the illustrations, giggling as James adopted funny voices for each character. Emily stood in the kitchen, watching them with a soft smile as she stirred a pot of soup. The scene was so ordinary, yet it felt extraordinary, a far cry from the lonely, guarded life James had once led. One sunny Saturday, the trio decided to spend the afternoon at the neighborhood park. Children's laughter filled the air as kites soared and soccer balls skidded across the grass. Maya dashed ahead, her hair flying behind her as she climbed the jungle gym, waving excitedly at James and Emily.
"Dad, watch me!"
she called, her voice bright and full of joy. James froze for a moment, the word Dad echoing in his ears. It wasn't the first time she'd called him that, but each time it filled him with a deep sense of fulfillment he could never have imagined. He waved back, grinning. "I'm watching, kiddo. You've got this." Emily, sitting beside him on a park bench, nudged him gently. "She's been waiting for you her whole life, you know." James glanced at her, his smile softening. "And I didn't even know I was waiting for her," he admitted. Emily's gaze lingered on him, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper in her eyes. "You've given us more than I ever thought possible, James. You gave us a home, safety, and a family." James looked at her, feeling a surge of emotion. "You two gave me that first. I didn't even realize how much I needed it." As the afternoon wore on, they sat together under the shade of a large oak tree, enjoying sandwiches Emily had packed. Maya chattered happily, recounting her week at school, her excitement for an upcoming art project, and her latest adventures with her friends. "You know," Maya said between bites, "I was really scared when I didn't have a home. But now, I'm not scared anymore. Not with you and Mommy." James felt his chest tighten with emotion. He reached out and ruffled her hair. "That's because you're the bravest kid I've ever met." Maya beamed, then leaned against him, her small hand slipping into his. "I love you, Dad." James swallowed hard, his voice thick as he replied, "I love you too, sweetheart." Later that evening, back at the apartment, the three of them curled up on the couch to watch a movie. Maya fell asleep halfway through, her head resting in James's lap as Emily draped a blanket over her. The glow of the television cast soft shadows across the room, and James found himself reflecting on how far they had come. The chance encounter with Maya that had started it all felt like a lifetime ago. Back then, he'd been a man consumed by routine, isolated from the world around him. Now, he was surrounded by love, a little girl who called him Dad, and a woman who had reignited his faith in family and connection. "You've changed, you know," Emily said softly, pulling James from his thoughts. He turned to her, a questioning look on his face. "How so?" "You're softer now," she said, a teasing smile on her lips. "But in a good way. You've let us in." James nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to Maya's sleeping form. "You and Maya taught me how to let people in. I didn't even realize how much I was missing until you two came into my life." Emily reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "You've given us everything, James, and I hope you know, we'll always be here for you too." In the months that followed, James fully embraced his new role in Emily and Maya's life. He attended Maya's school events, helped her with homework, and cheered the loudest at her soccer games. He and Emily found themselves sharing more quiet moments, their bond deepening with each passing day. James had spent years thinking he understood the meaning of service, dedicating his life to law enforcement and the community. But now, he realized the most profound service was in the love he gave to those closest to him. Emily and Maya had become his family, not by blood, but by choice, a choice that had transformed all their lives. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Maya held up a crayon drawing she had made at school. It depicted the three of them standing under a big tree, holding hands. Above them, in her uneven handwriting, were the words, "My forever family." James felt tears prick his eyes as he looked at the drawing. Emily reached over, placing her hand on his. "You're not just part of our lives, James," she said softly. "You're the heart of it." James nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion welling within him. "And you two are mine." As the night settled in and Maya drifted off to sleep, James stepped onto the balcony with Emily. They stood in comfortable silence, the city lights twinkling around them. "Do you ever wonder why it all happened?" Emily asked, breaking the quiet. James thought for a moment, then smiled. "I used to think it was just luck, but now I think it was meant to be. I didn't save Maya that day. She saved me." Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You've given us hope, James. A legacy of love that will carry us through anything." James turned to her, his gaze steady. "We built that legacy together, and it's just the beginning." As they stood there looking out at the world with newfound hope, James felt a deep sense of peace. He had found his purpose, not in his badge, but in the family he had chosen and the love they shared. And in that moment, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Sometimes, the greatest blessings come from the most unexpected encounters. Maya's bravery and Emily's strength reminded James of what truly matters: family, love, and the courage to care deeply. If their story touched your heart, remember that kindness can change lives. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.